What happens when a soldier turns a nation into his personal kingdom? Uganda in the 1970s found out in the most terrifying way possible. To the world, he was a towering man with a mischievous smile, dancing at public rallies, cracking jokes, and parading in front of cameras like a showman. But behind that smile lay a regime that would plunge a country into fear, silence, and bloodshed. Crowds once cheered his name. They waved flags, sang songs, and celebrated him as a liberator. Yet at the very same time, families disappeared overnight, soldiers hunted their own neighbors, and an entire nation lived on the edge of terror. The world remembers him with a mixture of disbelief and horror. Idi Amin, the man who styled himself as the last king of Scotland, the conqueror of an empire that no longer existed, and the ruler of Uganda with absolute power. By the end of this video, you'll know how one man rose from working in kitchens to becoming one of the most feared dictators in modern history. But to understand his reign, we have to ask, how did a man once celebrated as a hero become a symbol of terror? Why did ordinary people cheer for him at first? And what chain of events brought down a ruler who once believed he was untouchable? This is the story of Idi Amin's Uganda, a tale of power, fear, and the chilling cost of unchecked ambition. He wasn't born into royalty or even wealth. Idi Amin DADA began life in 1925 in the dusty fields of northwestern Uganda, far from the power centers of the capital. His early years were unremarkable. He herded goats, fetched water, and grew up in poverty. By most measures, he should have remained invisible, just another boy lost to history. But destiny had other plans. As a teenager, Amin found work as a cook and later as a kitchen helper for the British colonial army. He scrubbed pots, carried trays, and served meals to soldiers who barely noticed him. Yet while he served food, he watched them closely. The discipline, the weapons, the uniforms, these things fascinated him. He was not content with being in the background. His towering frame, nearly 6'4" and broad like a wrestler, made him impossible to ignore. When the opportunity came to enlist as a soldier, Amin didn't hesitate. In the King's African Rifles, a regiment of the British colonial forces, Amin's size and strength made him stand out. He wasn't the most educated. In fact, he struggled with reading and writing. But what he lacked in schooling, he made up for in raw physical presence and unquestioned loyalty to his commanders. He was fearless in battle, brutally efficient, and quick to obey. When sent to fight in Kenya during the Mau Mau Rebellion, his reputation grew. Stories of his ruthlessness spread. Stories that unsettled some but impressed those above him. By the 1960s, Uganda was gaining independence, and Amin, now a trusted military officer, climbed the ranks with surprising speed. His charisma played a part. He had an easy laugh. He loved music and dance. And he could connect with ordinary soldiers in a way that few officers could. He wasn't just feared, he was liked. His men admired his strength and his simple, direct manner. But it wasn't just charisma, it was also cunning. Amin knew how to play people against each other, how to appear loyal until the right moment to turn. When Milton Obote, Uganda's first prime minister, consolidated power and later became president, Amin became his ally and enforcer. Together, they maneuvered through Uganda's fragile early years as a new nation. But the relationship was fragile. Obote grew suspicious of his strong, ambitious general. Rumors swirled about hidden money, secret alliances, and growing resentment between the two men. And when Obote tried to rein him in, Amin was ready to act. In January 1971, while Obote was away at a Commonwealth meeting in Singapore, Amin struck. Tanks rolled into Kampala, and soldiers surrounded key buildings. The coup was swift and bloodless. Within hours, Idi Amin declared himself head of state. Crowds poured into the streets, cheering. For many Ugandans, this was a moment of relief. Obote had become unpopular, and Amin presented himself as the people's liberator. He waved to the masses, promised to restore democracy, and danced in celebration. The soldier who once scrubbed army pots was now president of Uganda. It was a stunning rise. A kitchen worker turned commander-in-chief, a man of the people who seemed larger than life. Foreign governments, including Britain and Israel, quickly recognized him. The world saw a charismatic African strongman who might bring stability to a young nation. But not everyone celebrated. Some saw in Amin's eyes a hunger for more than leadership. They sensed a man who craved not just power, but absolute control. And they were right. Because Amin's charm would soon turn into something terrifying. The same man who laughed and danced in public would order unspeakable acts behind closed doors. Idi Amin didn't just want to rule Uganda, he wanted the world to notice him. And notice him, they did. From the very beginning of his presidency, Amin mastered a strange and dangerous mix of politics and performance. He wasn't content with being seen as just another African leader. He wanted to be remembered as the most flamboyant, most unpredictable, and most talked about ruler of his age. Unlike the stiff politicians of his time, Amin was different. He cracked jokes in public speeches, danced with locals at rallies, and staged photo opportunities that made him look like a man of the people. He played the role of a cheerful giant, a leader who laughed loudly and embraced ordinary citizens. Crowds loved it, cameras captured it, and soon the world press couldn't resist covering him. He was the dictator who didn't look like one, at least on the surface. But behind the humor was a carefully crafted mask. Amin knew that as long as the world was entertained, fewer people would ask questions about what was really happening inside Uganda. His over-the-top declarations became part of his act. He gave himself ridiculous titles, the most famous being His Excellency, President for Life, Field Marshal Al-Haji Dr. Idi Amin DADA, VC, DSO, MC, Conqueror of the British Empire, and the last King of Scotland. It sounded absurd, even comical, and yet it was also dangerous, because behind the theatrics, he was tightening his grip on power. Foreign journalists were both fascinated and bewildered by him. To some, he seemed like a clown. To others, a ruthless strongman hiding behind a smile. Amin played them perfectly. He invited reporters to cover his speeches, staged grand parades, and made outrageous statements that guaranteed headlines. The world's media, hungry for spectacle, turned him into a celebrity dictator. Meanwhile, Ugandans who lived under his rule were learning a darker truth. Because while Amin was joking with cameras, people were disappearing in the night. Soldiers loyal to him hunted down anyone suspected of disloyalty. Universities, churches, and even the army itself became places of fear. But these stories rarely made it into the same papers that laughed at his antics. For many outside Uganda, Amin was still that smiling giant who loved attention. And then came one of his boldest tricks. A moment when Amin fooled not just his people, but also the global press. He staged an elaborate public event, packed it with cheering crowds, and invited international journalists to film it. What those reporters didn't know was that the entire scene was carefully choreographed. The applause, the singing, the joy, it wasn't spontaneous, it was theater. The world watched, clapped, and wrote glowing headlines, believing Amin was a beloved leader. We'll reveal exactly how he pulled it off in a moment. But first, you need to see how this pattern of spectacle and fear shaped life inside Uganda, where the cost of his performance was measured not in laughter, but in lives. Behind the parades and the laughter, Uganda was drowning in fear. Amin's rise to power had not been built on stability, but on the barrel of a gun. And to keep that grip tight, he turned on his own people. The army, once his ladder to power, became his first target. Officers suspected of loyalty to a bot were arrested, executed, or simply vanished. Whole divisions were purged, their bodies dumped into the Nile. At first it seemed like politics, the brutal clearing out of rivals. But soon it spread beyond the barracks, infecting every corner of Ugandan life. Ordinary citizens learned a new rhythm of survival. Speak carefully, trust no one, and never be noticed. Neighbors disappeared overnight. Friends went to work and never came home. Families whispered about loved ones who had been taken, but silence was often safer than asking questions. Even the sound of a knock at the door in the middle of the night could freeze a household in terror. One Ugandan survivor later described living under Amin as breathing, but never really alive. Streets were patrolled by soldiers whose loyalty was not to the people, but to the man at the top. Any sign of disobedience, a wrong word, or even being from the wrong ethnic group could turn you into a target. Fear was the invisible law that ruled the nation. And then came one of Amin's most infamous decisions. In 1972, he ordered the expulsion of Uganda's Asian community, tens of thousands of people of Indian descent who had lived in Uganda for generations. They were given just 90 days to leave, forced to abandon their businesses, homes, and lives. Imagine waking up one morning to be told that everything you own, everything your family has built, must be left behind, or else face the wrath of a dictator. To many Ugandans at the time, Amin framed it as liberation, seizing wealth from outsiders and giving it back to true Africans. For a brief moment, he was celebrated. Crowds cheered as shops and factories were handed over, but the cost was devastating. The Asian community had been the backbone of Uganda's economy, running banks, trade, and industries. When they were forced out, chaos followed. Skilled workers were gone, businesses collapsed, and shortages spread. Uganda's economy began to crumble, but by the time the damage was clear, Amin had already cemented his image as a nationalist hero. For those who stayed behind, the reality was even harsher. The killings escalated. Intellectuals, judges, journalists, and church leaders who spoke out were silenced. Nobody was untouchable. Even those within Amin's inner circle could be turned into enemies overnight. He was both unpredictable and paranoid, and that combination kept everyone off balance. Uganda became a place where life was measured by silence. If you kept quiet, you might survive. If you spoke, you disappeared. And through it all, Amin played the smiling showman to the outside world. But the walls were closing in. His enemies were gathering strength, and they weren't just inside Uganda. Forces beyond the country's borders were watching, waiting, and preparing to strike back. Idi Amin's reign wasn't confined to Uganda's borders. Once he had secured power at home, he turned his gaze outward, determined to make himself a global figure. And the world in many ways was baffled. Amin's diplomacy was, at best, eccentric, at worst, outright dangerous. He formed unusual alliances, shaking hands with leaders like Libya's Muammar Gaddafi, offering support to Palestinian factions, and even making bizarre statements that seemed to idolize Hitler's memory. It was as if he relished the attention, no matter how controversial. At the same time, Amin didn't shy away from open confrontations. He insulted Britain repeatedly, declaring his intent to conquer the last vestiges of the British Empire in Africa. He expelled Israelis, severed ties with the US, and famously threatened to invade neighboring countries on a whim. For foreign governments, Amin was an unpredictable puzzle, sometimes a threat, sometimes a spectacle, and always a story the press couldn't ignore. And then there was the moment that truly revealed the depths of his cunning, the media stunt we hinted at earlier. Amin invited journalists from around the world to a victory rally in Kampala. They were told it would be a spontaneous celebration, an authentic show of love and admiration from the Ugandan people. What they didn't realize was how carefully orchestrated everything was. Every cheer, every flag wave, every clapping hand had been choreographed. He had planted loyalists throughout the crowd, trained them to respond on cue, and even directed the photographers where to stand for maximum effect. When the cameras rolled, the world saw what looked like an outpouring of genuine support. Headlines praised Amin as a popular, charismatic leader. Few suspected the truth, that it was all theater. This event became a defining moment. To the world, Amin was larger than life, a ruler who could charm nations while terrifying his own people. But behind the laughter, the walls were closing in. Economic mismanagement, alienated neighbors, and growing resistance forces were quietly aligning against him. Amin, the man who had tricked the world once already, believed his power was untouchable. Yet the seeds of his undoing had been planted. And soon the very globe that watched him dance and jest would witness a dictator under siege, struggling to maintain control over a country that no longer feared him, or at least no longer obeyed blindly. Before we reach that turning point, though, we need to understand the full scope of life under Amin's shadow. The fear, the purges, and the human cost that no amount of charisma could hide. By 1978, Idi Amin's confidence had reached its peak, and with confidence came overreach. Fueled by bravado and the belief that he could act without consequence, Amin made one of the gravest decisions of his rule. He invaded Tanzania. Officially, he claimed it was a border dispute, but the reality was far more reckless. He believed his army could expand Uganda's influence with ease, and he underestimated both the resolve and capability of his neighbor. At first, Amin's forces moved quickly, capturing small towns and sending shockwaves through the Tanzanian countryside. But the victory was short-lived. Tanzania's army, well-organized and battle-hardened, struck back with a precision Amin had not anticipated. To make matters worse for him, Ugandan exiles, soldiers and civilians who had fled Amin's purges, returned to fight alongside the Tanzanians. What began as a confident expansion quickly turned into a desperate retreat. Inside Uganda, Amin's paranoia spiraled out of control. Every setback, every rumor of disloyalty was met with ruthless purges. Generals, soldiers, and even members of his own family were executed or mysteriously disappeared. The fear that had once kept the nation in line was no longer enough to mask the cracks in his regime. Reports of massacres and brutal reprisals filtered out to the world, revealing the dark truth beneath a smiling public persona. By April 1979, the Tanzanian-backed forces had closed in on Kampala, Uganda's capital. Amin's army, demoralized and outnumbered, crumbled under pressure. Streets once filled with cheering crowds now echoed with gunfire and the sounds of a regime in collapse. Amin fled, leaving behind a city in chaos and a country scarred by years of terror. Even as he escaped, Amin's legend, terrifying, absurd, and infamous, continued to grow. Stories of his bizarre orders, his brutality, and his outsized personality spread far beyond Uganda's borders. He had become a figure larger than life, a cautionary tale of unchecked power. But fleeing Uganda didn't end Amin's story. Where do you hide when the world sees you as a monster? When the country you ruled with fear has fallen, and the people you terrorized are free? Even in exile, the shadow of Amin's reign would loom, haunting not only the man himself, but the history of a nation still trying to heal. After fleeing Uganda in 1979, Idi Amin became a man without a country. He first sought refuge in Libya, where he was welcomed briefly by Muammar Gaddafi, a fellow strongman with a taste for spectacle. But Amin's presence there was fleeting. Even in exile, he could not command the fear and loyalty that had defined his rule at home. Eventually, he settled in Saudi Arabia, living quietly under the protection of a foreign government that wanted little more than to keep him out of international headlines. Gone were the rallies, the grandiose titles, and the cameras. Amin became nearly invisible, a shadow of the towering figure who had once controlled a nation. The people whose lives he had shattered remembered him vividly, though. The families of those who had disappeared, the communities torn apart by his purges, and the citizens forced into exile themselves. To them, Amin was not a man reduced to obscurity. He was a living reminder of terror. Even as he lived in relative comfort, Amin never fully faced the consequences of his reign. He avoided trial, and the world largely allowed him to fade into history quietly. Yet his reputation remained untarnished in the memory of those who had survived his brutality. In interviews and retrospectives, survivors spoke of fear, loss, and the absurdity of the man who had once declared himself the conqueror of the British Empire. Idi Amin died in 2003, far from the country he had ruled with iron fists. The man who had commanded armies, staged spectacles for the world, and ruled through terror ended his days powerless, almost forgotten, and still unrepentant. His life serves as a stark reminder of how absolute power can elevate a person to mythic heights, and how quickly it can vanish, leaving only the echoes of fear in its wake. The story of Idi Amin is not just about a man, it's about a nation scarred by the extremes of power and the fragility of trust. His rise, his reign, and his fall offer lessons that resonate far beyond Uganda's borders. Idi Amin's story is a journey that stretches from the dusty fields of Uganda to the global stage, and finally into quiet exile. He rose from a humble kitchen worker to a soldier whose sheer size and charisma propelled him through the ranks. He became a dictator whose charm and showmanship captivated the world. And yet, behind the laughter and dancing, he ruled with fear, orchestrating purges that left families devastated and a nation trembling. And finally, he fled. A man who once seemed untouchable, reduced to living in the shadows, remembered more for terror than triumph. What Amin's life teaches us is clear. Power, charisma, and fear can build empires, but they can never sustain them. A reign built on intimidation may command obedience, but it cannot create loyalty, trust, or lasting respect. No amount of spectacle or bravado can hide the cracks in a foundation built on terror. History has a way of revealing the truth, even decades later, reminding us that the consequences of unchecked power inevitably catch up to those who wield it without accountability. So what do we learn from Amin's Uganda? That no matter how loud fear speaks, how brilliant a public performance may appear, the truth of one's actions will always surface. The lives affected, the communities destroyed, and the lessons unlearned serve as a mirror to leaders everywhere. A warning of what happens when ambition goes unchecked and morality is ignored. If you want to explore more untold stories from Africa's complex and fascinating history, the legends, the rulers, and the events that shaped entire nations, hit subscribe. There's so much more to uncover, and each story is a window into courage, fear, ambition, and the human spirit. The story of Idi Amin is one chapter in a continent's history full of lessons waiting to be discovered.